One of my most requested videos is to make a newer, lighter weight camper with an aluminum frame and foam and fiberglass body. So that's exactly what I'm going to do in this build. So in this build I'm going to be making the second version of my bike camper, and I'm going to be trying to save as much weight as possible on this one, which means making an aluminum frame, a foam body, and as little wood as possible while still having it be structurally sound and professional. So first I'm marking ticks every 2 inches along both sides of a sheet of 1/2 inch finished grade pine plywood. Then I'm using these 2-inch ticks and this measurement cheat sheet to basically make a connect the dot outline of the shape I want this camper to be. Then with all the dots laid out, I can just use a straight edge to connect them all for my cut line. And for some of the curvier parts, I just had to freehand in a line that looked about right. Then I could cut out the shape using a fine-tooth wood jigsaw blade. And after sanding up the edge quick, I could trace this onto another sheet of plywood and cut it out. So I'm looking to keep as little of this wood as possible, really just where I need to screw into to support doors and windows, and the rest I'm going to replace with foam. So I measured out any doorways or anywhere that's going to need screws, and drew a line about 2 inches in from the perimeter, and the rest I'm going to cut out with my jigsaw. Then I measured out the cut lines for the doors. In this version I made a little bit longer than the other one, and I'm going to have 2 compartment doors that are completely separate from the main cabin. To cut out all 3 doors, I had to use a multi-tool to make a cut start point for my jigsaw, because I'm going to use the wood panel on the inside of the cut as the actual door itself, so I don't want to drill into it. And after a good sand around all the edges, one side panel is ready for some foam. And for the other panel, the only opening I'm going to have is this pretty large window. So I basically placed it where I wanted, and then cut out as much as possible of the remaining plywood. And to cut the rough opening for the window, I had the window laying face down where I was going to place it, and then I used a combination square to measure out how far I'm going to have to set back this cut line. Then I found this little piece of something that was about the right width I needed, so I used it to draw a line inside of the trace line of the window. Next I had to cut some 1/2 inch rigid foam insulation to fit the shape of the plywood I cut out. So I just traced the shape onto a sheet of foam and cut it out with a box cutter. Now I'm going to have to glue this foam and wood together, so I ran a quick test with 3 popular adhesives to see which one I want to use. I just glued a chunk of foam onto a scrap piece of wood and then broke it off to see how well of a bond it formed. And with these results, I'm going to use a combination of the foam fusion and the PL adhesive. So I glued up the backside of my plywood panel and pressed it onto 2 pieces of 1/2 inch foam. Then using just the foam fusion, I glued in the foam inserts. And a day later, I'm ready to cut out the wall panels. So using a flush trim bit on my router, I can easily cut the foam to the exact shape of the plywood beneath it. So the foam side of this panel is actually going to be the interior of the wall. So before I assemble everything, I'm going to fiberglass it right now and get it painted so it's not a pain in the ass later. So I mudded the seam with some normal drywall compound and sanded that off once it was dry. And then I used some painter's tape to tape around every edge. So I decided to use real fiberglass in this video instead of the poor man's fiberglass I used last time, mainly because I like to try new stuff, and also because this camper is going to have a lot more foam structure, and the real fiberglass should be a lot more rigid than the poor man's fiberglass. So this is the first time I'm ever doing fiberglass, and I really have no idea what I'm doing here. So I laid out the fiberglass sheet and cut it to the rough size. Then I mixed up some 2-part epoxy resin. Then my plan was to pour the epoxy resin on top of the sheet, thinking it would soak through, but I found out I had to roll on epoxy onto the foam first, and then lay out the fiberglass. Then I could pull out most of the wrinkles with my hands. Then I'd add a little more epoxy on top and use a Bondo trowel to spread it around and get out all the wrinkles. And once I had everything wet out nicely, I would use the trowel to scrape off any of the excess epoxy onto the unused fiberglass. This was my last step after I made sure all the bubbles and wrinkles were worked out of the fiberglass fabric. After about 4 hours, the epoxy has cured a bit, but it's still a little bit tacky, and this is the perfect time to cut away the excess. So using a box cutter, I cut around every edge as tight as possible. You don't want to leave this too long because if it gets fully cured, it's going to be really hard to cut off with a knife. The next day, the pieces are cured up nicely and I'm taking them outside for a good sanding. You also want to make 100% sure you're wearing a mask when sanding fiberglass because you don't want to breathe any of this dust in. It's also really itchy, so try to do it outside or wear a sweater or something. Next, I'm prepping these panels for paint. So I'm just using some 1-inch painter's tape and taping around the edges where I know I'm going to have to use some sort of adhesive because I don't want to put that on top of the paint. I'd rather attach that directly to the fiberglass. Then I'm rolling on 1 coat of bullseye primer. And starting about an hour later, I did 3 coats of exterior white paint. One thing I forgot is to double up the plywood where the door latch is going to be, so I just have this tiny block of 1/2-inch plywood that I'm going to glue in place. Now these panels are ready to be walls. So I cut the base to size out of a sheet of 1/2-inch plywood. Then screwed the walls into place. Next, I ripped some 2.5-inch wide strips of plywood and measured out the width between the two walls. I needed 11 of these all cut to the same width to be the stringers between the walls. I used a combination square set to 1 inch to draw a line 1 inch in from the perimeter of the wall. Then I lined up the outside edge of the stringer with the line we just drew and screwed it in place. I also had to come back once all 4 screws were in and take out 1 screw at a time to recess the hole down a little bit so that the screw heads weren't popping out over the top of the plywood. I put these stringers on roughly 16-inch centers around the whole cabin. For this part, I was kind of torn because I wanted to make this camper as light as possible, but I also wanted to make it a lot cooler than the last version. And by cooler, I mean having some shelving and like a pull-out bar top. The design I was thinking of was probably going to cost me an extra 30 pounds, but ultimately I decided to say f*** it because it was going to be way better. And it's being pulled by an e-bike anyway. I wanted to have the cabin separate from the storage compartments, but also accessible, so I came up with this little sliding door system. So I cut out a couple strips of 1/4-inch plywood at 1 inch and 1.5-inch widths. Then I cut out some doors out of 1/4-inch plywood and used a Forstner bit to drill some finger holes. So these doors can slide along the little rail system I built and allow me to access the compartment behind it. Which is perfect because behind this I'm going to make a slide-out countertop that's going to have the power bank on it. And then I don't have to bring the power bank and wiring into the main cabin. The next day I started making the door stops for all 3 doors. So using some 1/4-inch plywood, I traced on the shape of the door, and then measured in some inside and outside offsets. Before cutting it out and sanding it down. Then I use some 2-part epoxy to attach it. Now to make that slide out countertop I was talking about. I have some 28-inch drawer slides, and I'm basically going to attach a drawer the same as I would in a kitchen cabinet. Now these slides are pretty heavy and they're counted in that extra 30 pounds I was talking about earlier. So I mounted in 2 boards to attach the slides to. And then screwed in the slides with some 1/2-inch screws. I made sure the spacing on these was the exact same on both sides. Then I made up my shelf. I used some 2-inch plywood walls and made the width the exact width between the 2 slides. For the length, I made it about 1 inch shorter than the overall width of the interior of the cabin. These sliders can support like over 50 pounds, so it should be fine for whatever I'm using it for. Then I added in the rest of the stringers and it's ready for a roof. For the roof, I'm just using some 1-inch foam board. So I cut 2 sheets down to the same width as the stringers. And on the first sheet, I measured out ticks every 2 inches. And then used the Craig track jig to cut lines about 2/3 of the way through the thickness of the foam. This is going to allow the foam to bend a lot easier around the shape of the teardrop. I then had to notch out a little wire gap that's going to run the USB cable for the cabin light. So I'm using PL adhesive to mount this foam roof in place. I started working my way up from the bottom with 3-inch screws and basically clamping it into place every few inches to get the bend perfect. These screws are just temporary and I'll take them out tomorrow once the adhesive is dried. And before I get too far towards the back, I have to run that USB cable for the light through that slot. and then finish up installing the sheet. For the second roof panel, I cut the slots every 3/4 inch for the hard bend at the back of the trailer, and then after that every 3 inches until it met up with the first panel. And with the roof panels in place, I can use some expanding foam to fill in any remaining gaps. Now to cover up the pink foam inside the cabin, I'm using this wood veneer. This is real maple and it's 1/32 of an inch thick, meaning it weighs almost nothing. So after doing some measuring, I cut it to the shape that I needed. And then since it was curving the wrong way, I had to use a steamer to pull out that natural curve and wrap it around the other way. Then I applied a generous amount of PL adhesive and stuck it in place between the stringers. Now I'm ready to cut off all that excess foam and take out all the clamp screws before sanding down the body. One of the worst parts of working with this 1/2 inch foam, as you can see here, is it's actually slightly over 1/2 an inch, so I'm gonna have to sand this all down to match the width of the plywood. The more time you spend sanding and getting everything nice and uniform, the better the final product's gonna look, so take your time. And it will take f***ing forever. But with everything all sanded up, I can now take some drywall compound and go along and fill in all the edges and any screw holes and any imperfections. And the next day I can sand all that out as well. Now it's time to start fiberglassing the outside, starting with the bottom. And I'm doing this in the exact same method as I did the interior wall panels. So I'm not going to explain a ton about fiberglassing this. Like before, I first laid down some epoxy, and then put on some fiberglass sheeting and some more epoxy on top. The first day I got the bottom and the door jambs done. Notice the painter's tape around all the edges. This is so when I'm squeezing out all the extra epoxy from underneath the fiberglass sheet, the drips will run off onto this painter's tape, and then I can take it off while I'm cutting off the excess fabric a few hours later, and I don't have to sand off all these drips. Once I had all 4 sides fiberglassed, I took a little extra epoxy and just brushed it along all the seams to join the layers together. I know this could definitely use another layer of epoxy, but I'm going to leave it as is because it's going to be getting 4 or 5 layers of outdoor paint still, and that should be sufficient to weatherproof it just fine. Now to those door panels I cut out a while ago. First I sanded the edges on all 3 doors nice and clean. I also made sure to take off a little bit more material with the sander so that there's a bit more of an air gap between the frame and the door rather than just the width of one jigsaw blade. For the main door, I got another sheet of 1/2-inch plywood and traced on the door outline. And then I drew a line about 2 inches inside of this line to be a cut line to get rid of as much wood as possible again. I also left a little excess material around where the latch is going to be. And the rest I'm going to fill up with foam. Getting rid of this chunk of plywood will save me about 6 pounds. In the other panel, I also cut a hole to size this window in the exact same way I measured out to cut the other window. Then I glued the 2 panels together and clamped it down with some heavy stuff. For the smaller doors, I just glued on an extra width of solid plywood because the weight savings I was going to gain wasn't worth the extra fiberglass work and time it was going to take. And a few hours later, I could use the foam fusion to glue in the foam panel into the main door. Then the next day, I could use the trim router to route the second panel to the exact shape of the first panel. And like with the body, I had to sand the foam down in the door to the proper thickness. And mud in the gaps. Then I fiberglassed the outer side of the doors in the exact same way as the body. I didn't do the edges of the door because I sanded this down pretty good and the layers of paint should protect this just fine. Now, after one more good sanding, we're ready to start the painting process. So starting off with our bullseye primer again. Then I did 4 coats of white outdoor paint. Next I want to mount the doors, but first I have to install this RV door latch. Well, I messed up again and I completely forgot that these latches are meant for a minimum of 1.25" door thickness.
This is hanging over.
So I'm gonna have to add on this little plate of 1/4" plywood. When I was painting, I also painted the whole inside of the cutout, just so that if any water leaks in through the latch, it's not just going straight into unprotected wood. For the slide out door, I won't need any hinges, so I just use some cabinet screws to screw it directly into the front face of the pull-out shelf. For latches on these two smaller doors, I'm using these little key cam locks. So I siliconed it in as good as possible. Then I added on the lock-in nut and installed the latch in the right orientation. So with the doors installed, I marked out the paint lines, and then I'm going to take off 2 of the doors and paint them separately. So I started out with some clean black edge work. And then added in some gray accent color. Now we're ready for the final assembly of the cabin. So I put the doors back on, and this time I siliconed the screw holes for the hinges. I also added in some foam weather stripping on the door stops. Then I did some interior finishing touches. Then it's on to installing the windows. But first I'm going to have to cut some flanges for the interior of the cabin. So I traced out the window, and then traced out a line about a 1/2 inch wider than the window. Then I measured how much frame overhang I'm going to need, and drew a line for that and cut it out. Then I applied a strip of butyl tape around the window. And set the window into place. I used some 2-part epoxy on the back of the window flange. And once I had that in place, I nailed it into the body. Then I pre-drilled some holes into the window frame and used some 1/2 inch metal screws to screw the window into place. Then apply a bead of silicone around the outside of the window. And the windows are all done. Now I just have to install the door latch before I move on to welding the aluminum frame. I just cut this little plastic cover out of an old Tupperware container lid to hide the inside guts of this latch. So before I get to welding the frame, I need to know what I'm going to be towing this camper with. After I made my first camper, the e-bike company AddMotor reached out and wondered if they could send me a free e-bike. I said I'm not really looking to do any sponsored content, but they said just take a bike and use it however you want and give your honest thoughts on it. So here's my honest thoughts. This thing is f***ing sweet and I'm never using a normal bike again. It's pretty much like ripping around on a motorcycle. But back to that frame build. So since I'm trying to save weight on this one, I decided to use aluminum, even though that meant I had to buy a whole bunch of new aluminum tools. For the aluminum itself, I'm using some 1-inch square by 1/8 inch thickness. And one of the biggest benefits to aluminum is you can just cut it with a normal miter saw as long as you take your time. Now I've never really worked with aluminum before, nor am I great at welding it, I found out. But some of the basics are aluminum needs to be really clean to weld, which means rubbing it down with a stainless steel brush and wiping it off with some acetone. And that means every single side of every single joint. Now I practiced welding some aluminum for a full day before shooting this, and still the first couple welds were pretty rough. But I figured it out over time, and at the end I grinded off whatever I needed to and re-welded it a little stronger. After welding a good portion of the frame together, I decided to lay it out and measure out the tongue length just to make sure that everything's on track. And to angle the tongue in towards the mount on the bike, I slotted out a 45-degree slot and then bent that over and welded it solid. Also, notice how I left quite a bit extra length on the tongue. That's because I'm going to cut it to the exact size I need later. For the trailer wheels, I wanted to use some wide 4-inch tires to match the look of the bike, and the cheapest ones I could find was on a brand new bike. So, you know, that makes perfect sense. I made the axle blocks out of some 1/4-inch by 3-inch flat bar, and drilled in an axle size hole and welded it onto the frame. To get the width of the outer arm, I had to get a rough measurement on the width of the axle. I also cut these about 1 inch longer than needed so that I could clamp it onto the frame and install the wheel and get an exact measurement of how far to cut them down, instead of making them too short and having to rebuild the whole thing. So now I can measure the gap I have on the axle and then unclamp it and take it to the miter saw and cut it to size. Then I'll square the wheel by measuring the gap from the frame to the rim on both sides, giving it a slight tap to make any corrections. And then these arms are ready to weld on. Now starting on the 4-corner jack system, I first cut these 1-inch lengths of the 1-inch tubing. And then I drilled a clear through pinhole and welded them onto the four corners of the frame. Then I took some 3/4 inch aluminum tubing and cut them down into 4 20-inch pieces. Then I marked pinholes every inch. And drilled them out with a pilot bit before bowing them out to the size of the pins I'm using. Then I just welded on these 1/4 inch flat bar feet. Now the frame's pretty much done, but in my typical fashion, I have to go back and grind off all my welds and hide the evidence. I also use some sanding pads to give it a good polish because I'm not going to paint this, I'm just going to use the natural look of the aluminum. Now I've got to make the hitch that can mount onto the bike. So I took this kit bike hitch off Amazon and sanded off the paint, and I'm going to mount it into these 2 little threaded holes on the back arm of the e-bike with a piece of 1/4 inch flat bar steel. So I cut that to shape with an angle grinder and a cutoff wheel. Then I marked out the drill points and drilled them through. And then welded the hitch onto the flat bar and gave it a good grinding and sanding. Then I attached it onto the bike with some M5 bolts. I'm also going to prime it and paint it black, but this is just a dry fit to make sure everything's working. Then I took the trailer portion of the hitch and kind of guessed where I needed to make my cuts and drill points. Then I had to hand file out the aluminum for about a half hour just to get this spring to be able to slide inside of it. And even with all that filing, I couldn't get it far enough, so I just drilled a second hole and mounted it there. Finally, the last piece of the puzzle is complete and I'm ready to mount the camper on it. So I'm going to install some 1/4 inch lag bolts at 8 points through the frame. So first I drilled into the body and applied a little silicone over the hole. Then I went ahead and started bolting the body to the frame. Then I installed my 4-point stabilizers with some lock pins. And it's ready for some final touches and loading it up. So as the last thing, I'm going to install some solar power. So I have this cheap 100-watt flexible solar panel I got off of Amazon, and I just used some silicone to stick it onto the top of the camper. But the solar itself is not much good without something to charge. This is the Plywood EB3A, and it's a portable lithium-ion power bank that I can plug a solar panel directly into to give me basically infinite power. It's got all the hookups I need, including USB and AC power, so it should be perfect in this camper to charge whatever I need. Full disclosure, Plywood did send me this for free, but I said I'm going to give my honest review of it, and my review is that it's a great device for a build like this where you're going to have solar and you need small amounts of power to charge devices on the go. To hook up the solar, I just had to use the provided solar panel charging cable, and I ran the panel wires in through the roof of the camper and plugged straight into the power bank. And one last touch is this kerosene camping grill that I'm going to use to cook some snacks on the road. And finally, after about 250 hours of working time, this camper is ready for its maiden voyage. One of my favorite things about this e-bike is the banana seat and the flip down pegs, which makes it perfect for my girlfriend that doesn't exist. But you know what they always say, women are attracted to success, so I decided to go out and use my YouTube fame to get my very own girlfriend. Perfect. Don't mind the look on her face, she's just really excited and can't believe she's here on my 83% male viewed channel. So I had a goal to make this camper about 100 pounds. And the total dry weight of this camper, not including anything removable like the power bank, came in at about 135 pounds, which really makes me question what my other camper must actually weigh. With this e-bike, I got a range of about 40 kilometers, but the 4 sets of 4-inch tires are definitely taking enough off of this range. If you want to build this for practical long distance use, I'd definitely recommend using normal width tires. As for budget, I spent about $3,000 in materials and about 250 hours of working time on this camper. So now the question on your mind is probably, what am I going to do with 2 bike campers? Well, that's a tough one. I really wanted to give this away to somebody that comments on the video, and I actually already had this ending already edited and ready to send out with everything you needed to know to enter. But apparently there's a ton of guidelines that YouTube puts on giveaways and even just the government themselves. And a big desirable item like this is definitely going to raise some red flags that I'm not legally prepared for. So ideally I would love to give this away to one of my subscribers, and I might still do that. Some other options are I might auction this off on eBay, or I might donate it to someone in need like a homeless person. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments below, and while you're at it, drop me a build idea for something you'd love to see in a future video. Also, if you're interested in building this camper, pick up my plans on Etsy for $10 and make your life a million times easier having the exact dimensions and cheat sheets I use. Thanks so much for watching my video, and if you're new here and you like this kind of content, hit the subscribe button and see what I get up to next. And a hint, it involves 3 75-inch flat screen TVs.